Get this kid away from my Ferrari before he scratches something he could never afford. The laugh came instantly. Not one laugh. Dozens. Sharp, rich, comfortable laughs. The kind of laughter people used when they already believed someone beneath them deserved humiliation. 200 guests stood beneath crystal chandeliers inside the glass atrium of the Valmont Grand Hotel while soft violin music drifted through the room like expensive perfume. White marble floors reflected the glow from suspended gold lights overhead. Waiters in black gloves carried silver trays through clusters of investors, influencers, athletes, and luxury collectors. And right in the center of all of it sat the car, a one-of-one Ferrari F80 prototype. Midnight black, carbon body shimmering beneath showroom lights, worth over $4 million. The engine cover was raised. 3 certified Ferrari technicians stood beside it looking nervous, because the car was dead, completely dead. No ignition, no response, nothing. And now a thin black teenager wearing janitor coveralls was standing 3 feet from it, while one of the richest men in the room looked at him like trash stuck to his shoe. The billionaire smiled wider for the crowd. "You hear me, kid?" he said loudly. "This machine costs more than your entire bloodline." More laughter. Phones came out. People loved public humiliation when it wore a designer suit. The teenager said nothing, just looked at the car. Not the crowd, not the cameras, the car. That silence irritated the billionaire immediately. Men like Preston Vale fed on reactions, fear, begging, embarrassment. But this kid just stood there, holding a mop handle loosely in one hand while his eyes stayed fixed on the exposed engine compartment. Calm, too calm. Preston stepped closer. "You cleaning staff now think YouTube makes you mechanics?" A woman near the champagne tower smirked into her glass. One of the Ferrari techs crossed his arms. Security was already watching. The teenager finally spoke, quietly. "There's nothing wrong with the ignition system." The room reacted instantly. Scoffs, chuckles. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Preston blinked once, then laughed harder than before. "Nothing wrong?" he repeated. 3 Ferrari master technicians spent 6 hours on this car." The boy nodded once. "It's not the ignition." Preston looked around dramatically. "Did everybody hear that?" More laughter. Even the musicians stopped playing. The boy took 1 step closer to the Ferrari, and that's when Preston's smile disappeared. "Don't touch it." Silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives right before something ugly happens. The teenager slowly lifted his eyes toward Preston for the first time. No fear in them, no challenge either, just certainty. "You replaced the wrong sensor," he said softly. One of the technicians immediately snapped. "You don't even know what system this car uses." The boy looked at him. "Yes, I do." The technician opened his mouth, closed it. Something about the way the kid answered unsettled him. Preston noticed. His ego flared instantly. "You think you can fix a $4 million hybrid Ferrari better than certified engineers?" The boy glanced back toward the engine. "I know why it won't start." The crowd leaned in. Preston smiled again. Cruel this time. Dangerous. "Well then," he said loudly, "if you're so smart—" He looked around the ballroom, at the phones recording, at the guests waiting for entertainment, then back at the kid. "You've got 5 minutes." The room buzzed immediately. Preston pointed toward the Ferrari. 5 minutes to prove you belong near this car." A few guests laughed nervously. Others exchanged looks, 'cause suddenly this didn't feel funny anymore. The kid set the mop against a pillar, walked slowly toward the Ferrari. And Preston Vale had no idea the next 5 minutes were about to destroy his entire reputation. But 6 hours earlier, nobody in that ballroom even knew the kid existed. The Valmont Grand Hotel looked less like a hotel and more like a monument built by people terrified of appearing ordinary. Italian marble walls, golden elevators, white orchids flown in daily. Everything smelled faintly of citrus polish and money. Outside, a fleet of exotic cars lined the entrance like museum pieces. Lamborghinis, McLarens, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces. Drivers in tailored suits stood nearby pretending not to stare at each other's wealth. Inside the lower maintenance corridors beneath the ballroom, the atmosphere changed completely. Concrete floors, buzzing fluorescent lights, bleach, mildew, steam pipes rattling overhead. Nobody downstairs wore watches worth more than rent. Nobody cared about luxury. That's where 19-year-old Elijah Carter worked. Night sanitation, temporary staff, minimum wage, invisible. Most guests upstairs never even looked directly at workers like him. Their eyes slid past janitors the same way they ignored wall fixtures or trash cans. But Elijah noticed everything. Always. Especially machines. Especially engines. Especially sounds. At 6:12 that morning, he was polishing elevator rails when he heard it. Not loud. Most people wouldn't have caught it. A metallic pulse buried beneath the distant growl of an exotic engine outside the loading dock. Elijah froze. Head tilted slightly. Then went back to work. But his eyes narrowed. 'Cause something about that rhythm felt wrong. 3 hours later, the Ferrari arrived. The entire hotel shifted around it instantly. Security doubled, managers panicked, event staff whispered nonstop. Because Preston Vale wasn't just wealthy, he was internet-famous wealthy. Millions of followers, luxury empire owner, real estate investor, social media personality. The kind of man who live-streamed charity donations while making sure cameras captured his watch. Tonight's gala was supposed to unveil his newest acquisition, the prototype Ferrari. Nobody else in America had one yet. Which made the breakdown catastrophic. By noon, Ferrari technicians had locked down the ballroom. Diagnostic tablets everywhere. Panels removed, voices tense, and the car still wouldn't start. The lead technician, Martin Griggs, had spent 17 years working Ferrari systems. He was considered elite. But by 4 p.m., sweat had soaked through his collar. Run it again. Nothing. Battery relay? Fine. Voltage? Stable. Fuel mapping? Perfect. Nothing made sense. The engine should have turned over. Instead, the system kept silently rejecting ignition like the car itself refused to wake up. Preston Vale arrived shortly after, and immediately started making everyone miserable. You flew specialists from Miami. For this? Martin clenched his jaw. We're isolating the issue. You've had 6 hours. We're dealing with a prototype system. Preston looked at the dead Ferrari like it had personally insulted him. You know what this launch cost me? Nobody answered. Because men like Preston never asked questions for information, only intimidation. Downstairs, Elijah quietly emptied ballroom trash bins while overhearing fragments of conversation through the service hallway. Hybrid lockout? Electrical conflict? Ferrari engineering hotline. System rejection. Elijah slowed. Not obvious, just enough to listen. His father used to say engines talked long before they failed. Most mechanics just stopped listening. At 17, Elijah could identify transmission problems by vibration patterns through concrete. At 14, he rebuilt an alternator using scrap copper and a dead lawnmower battery. At 11, he sat beside his father in a collapsing garage in South Chicago while old jazz played from a cracked radio and learned the difference between mechanics and diagnosis. Anybody can replace parts, his father told him once while tightening a fuel line on a rusted Corvette. Real mechanics listen. Not here, listen. There's music in machines, his father used to say. Rhythm, timing, pressure, hesitation. Every engine tells the truth eventually. Then his father died. Factory accident, crushed under faulty hydraulic equipment. The company settled quietly. No lawsuit, no justice, just silence and bills. Elijah left school 2 years later to support his mother and little sister. Night jobs, warehouse work, cleaning crews, whatever paid. But every spare minute still belonged to engines, junkyards, forums, old manuals, hybrid systems, European electrical architecture. Most people assume poor kids wasted time. Elijah studied machines like scripture. And upstairs, a $4 million Ferrari was screaming its problem to anyone patient enough to listen. At 7:40 p.m., Elijah entered the ballroom for routine floor maintenance. That's when he saw it up close for the first time. The Ferrari F80 prototype. Beautiful, aggressive, low enough to look dangerous sitting still. Guests circled it, taking photos while technicians argued beside exposed engine components. Elijah slowed near the rear wheel. Martin noticed immediately. Hey, sharp tone, dismissive. This area is restricted. Elijah nodded, started moving away, then paused, just for half a second. Because he heard it again, a faint clicking beneath the rear compartment, tiny, irregular. Most people would ignore it completely. Elijah's eyes narrowed. HVIL, high voltage interlock loop, the safety circuit verifying hybrid battery integrity, but the rhythm was inconsistent, not broken, interrupted, like a skipped piano note. He glanced toward the wiring harness near the battery shield, dustless, except one section, tiny abrasion marks, almost invisible. Elijah stared longer. Martin caught him looking. You deaf? Several guests turned. Elijah spoke carefully. The interlock loop is cycling. Martin blinked. What? The system thinks the battery disconnect is unstable. One technician laughed instantly. Another rolled his eyes. Martin stared hard at Elijah now. How would you even know what HVIL is? Elijah shrugged slightly. You can hear it. The silence after that sentence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then came the laughter, real laughter this time. Technicians, guests, even a waiter nearly choked smiling. Martin smirked. You can hear a high-voltage interlock loop. Elijah nodded once. Yes. Martin looked at the others. This janitor says he can hear electrical cycling. More laughter. Phones appeared again. 'Cause humiliation always became content around wealthy people. Elijah should have walked away. Probably wanted to. But then Preston Vale entered the ballroom, and everything escalated. Preston loved audiences, loved dominance, loved spectacle. When he noticed the crowd laughing around a maintenance worker, curiosity pulled him over immediately. What's happening here? Martin grinned. Kid says he knows what's wrong with your Ferrari. Preston looked Elijah up and down slowly. The coveralls, cleaning gloves, scuffed boots, invisible worker, then smiled. That dangerous rich man smile. Is that right? Elijah stayed calm. The battery loop is rejecting continuity? Preston laughed instantly. English. The car thinks part of the hybrid system is unsafe. Martin crossed his arms. We already checked continuity. Elijah glanced toward the rear harness again. Not manually. Martin's expression changed slightly. Tiny shift, tiny crack, because manual continuity tracing on a prototype Ferrari hybrid system took time, patience, skill. Most modern technicians relied heavily on software diagnostics. Elijah noticed the hesitation immediately. So did Preston. And Preston hated uncertainty, especially near witnesses. You trying to embarrass my engineers? No. Then what are you doing? Elijah looked back at the Ferrari. Listening. That answer irritated Preston more than arrogance would have. Because confidence without performance sounded insane. And yet the kid didn't sound insane, just certain. One older valet named Curtis watched quietly from across the ballroom. His eyes stayed on Elijah. Not shocked. Interested. Curtis had spent 30 years around luxury cars. Bentleys, Aston Martins, Ferraris. And he recognized something rare in the boy's posture. Stillness. Real technicians move differently around machines. Carefully, respectfully, like surgeons entering an operating room. Elijah carried that same energy. Preston didn't see it. 'Cause Preston only noticed status. And status told him this kid was nothing. So he decided to turn the moment into entertainment. By 8:15 p.m., nearly 200 guests surrounded the Ferrari display. Champagne flowing, phones recording, whispers spreading fast. The janitor thinks he can fix it. No way! This is insane. Bus station! Preston stood center stage, loving every second. He placed one hand on the Ferrari roof dramatically. You know what I think? Nobody answered. I think social media has convinced people talent matters more than pedigree. A few guests nodded cautiously. Preston pointed toward Elijah. Kid probably watched 3 TikTok videos and now thinks he's Enzo Ferrari. Laughter again. Elijah stayed silent. That silence started bothering people now, because humiliation feels less fun when the victim refuses to break. A blonde influencer near the front whispered to her friend, "Why isn't he leaving?" Her friend didn't answer, because secretly everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why was he still calm? Preston walked closer. You know how much my watch costs? Elijah said nothing. More than your yearly salary. Several guests laughed automatically, conditioned, like applause signs existed somewhere overhead. Then Preston leaned in closer, low voice now, crueler. You people always mistake access for equality. A few smiles faded. That sentence landed differently. Ugly, too honest. Even some wealthy guests looked uncomfortable now. Elijah finally lifted his eyes fully toward Preston, and for the first time all night, somebody in that ballroom looked at the billionaire without intimidation. You asked why the car won't start, Elijah said quietly. Not for a lecture on class. The room shifted instantly. Not loud, but emotionally. People felt it. That subtle line crossing. Preston felt it too. His jaw tightened. Because beneath the calm tone sat something worse than disrespect. Control. And Preston suddenly realized he no longer owned the room completely. So he escalated. Hard. You think because you memorized a few engine terms you belong up here? Elijah didn't answer. Preston smiled wider. Go back downstairs. Silence. Go mop floors where you belong. Nobody laughed this time. Too harsh. Too public. A woman near the back slowly lowered her phone. Curtis the valet looked disgusted. Martin shifted uncomfortably. Even the violinist stared downward awkwardly, but nobody spoke. That was the important part. Nobody spoke. Because expensive rooms train people to protect power first and morality second. Preston sensed the discomfort immediately, so he doubled down instead of retreating. Classic bully instinct. "If this kid fixes my Ferrari," he announced loudly, "I'll hand him $50,000 cash tonight." Murmurs exploded across the ballroom. 50,000. Preston grinned. "But if he touches something and damages it?" He paused, smiling directly at Elijah now. Security escorts him out in handcuffs. The room froze. Several people exchanged stunned looks, because suddenly this wasn't humiliation anymore. It was coercion. Elijah remained still, but Curtis noticed his fingers tighten once at his side. Tiny movement, tiny crack in the armor. Preston saw it too, and smiled. There it was, finally, fear. Except it wasn't fear, it was restraint. Elijah looked at the Ferrari again, then at Martin. Not Preston. Martin. "The rear harness shielding was removed twice, Martin blinked. "How do you know that?" "One fastener's over-torqued." Martin's face changed instantly, because that was true. Nobody else knew it. The ballroom went quiet again. Preston looked between them. "What does that mean?" Martin hesitated. Dangerous hesitation. "It means—" He started slowly. He noticed something accurate. The room buzzed immediately. Elijah walked toward the rear compartment slowly. No dramatic movements, no performance, just focus. And suddenly people stopped seeing a janitor. Because competence changes the atmosphere around a person before proof ever arrives. Preston noticed the shift immediately, and hated it. "You've got 5 minutes, he snapped. Elijah nodded once, then leaned over the exposed hybrid compartment. Silence spread through the ballroom like smoke. Even glasses stopped clinking. People moved closer unconsciously, phones lifted higher, and Elijah ignored every single one of them. His fingers hovered near the harness assembly without touching, listening first, always listening first. His father's voice echoed in memory. "Machines tell you where they hurt." Elijah closed his eyes briefly. Click, pause, click, click, irregular, not random. He opened his eyes. "There." Martin stepped closer immediately. "Where?" Elijah pointed toward a narrow section beneath the carbon shielding. "Microfracture in the interlock sleeve." Martin frowned. "That's impossible." Elijah looked at him calmly. "It's grounding during vibration." Martin crouched lower, flashlight out. Several seconds passed. Then his expression changed, tiny but real. "There's where here," Preston scoffed loudly. "Where doesn't kill a Ferrari." Elijah finally reached carefully into the compartment, gentle, precise, like touching something alive. The crowd watched every movement. He adjusted the harness slightly, then stopped, listening again. Clicking stabilized instantly. Martin's eyes widened. "No way!" Elijah spoke softly. "The loop's stabilizing because the tension changed." Martin grabbed his scanner rapidly, ran diagnostics again. Everyone waited. Silence. 10 seconds, 15. Then Martin stared at the screen. Pale, the fault code was gone. Completely gone. The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. Preston stepped forward immediately. "Start it." Martin hesitated, hands suddenly nervous, then pressed ignition. The Ferrari roared to life so violently several guests jumped. Deep, violent, beautiful. The sound filled the ballroom like an explosion wrapped in symphony. People gasped. Someone cursed under their breath. The engine purred perfectly. No warnings, no fault lights, nothing. Martin slowly looked up at Elijah, stunned. The older valet Curtis closed his eyes briefly and smiled to himself, because he knew. This wasn't luck, and Preston Vale went completely still. The billionaire stared at the running Ferrari like it had betrayed him personally, then at Elijah, then back at Martin. "Explain." Martin swallowed hard. "The harness insulation was fractured beneath the shielding." "How did you miss that?" Martin didn't answer, because the truth was humiliating. Software never caught it. The system failure only appeared under subtle vibration load. Elijah diagnosed it by sound, by rhythm, by instinct. In 5 minutes, after elite technicians failed for 6 hours. The crowd realized it all at once. And suddenly the energy inside the ballroom changed. Fast. Very fast. The same people laughing earlier now looked uncomfortable making eye contact. Phones lowered. Smiles faded. Because witnessing injustice feels entertaining right until the victim proves everyone wrong. Then shame enters the room. Preston felt the shift immediately, and panic flickered behind his eyes for the first time all night, small, but visible. Men like him survive by controlling perception, and perception was slipping away, so he did what arrogant men always do when reality humiliates them. He tried to rewrite it. "Lucky guess," Preston said quickly, too quickly. Martin looked at him, then back at Elijah. "No," Martin said quietly. The room stilled again, because now one authority figure had finally spoken truth aloud. Martin stepped toward Elijah slowly. "How did you hear the cycling?" Elijah shrugged slightly. "The relay timing was uneven." Martin stared. "That's almost impossible to detect by ear." Elijah nodded once. "My father taught me." The way he said it changed something emotionally. No arrogance, no performance, just memory. A quiet ache sat behind the sentence. And suddenly the room saw him differently again. Not a janitor, not a joke, a son, a kid carrying somebody's legacy. Preston interrupted immediately. "Well, congratulations," he snapped. "You found a loose wire." Elijah looked toward him calmly. "It wasn't loose." Preston's jaw tightened. "The point stands." "No," Elijah said softly. "It doesn't." Silence. Heavy silence. Several guests actually turned away now, because the balance of power had shifted so dramatically it became painful to watch. Preston stepped closer, anger rising visibly. "You think fixing one problem makes you special?" Elijah answered immediately. "No." That response stunned the room more than arrogance would have, because confidence without ego is terrifying. Preston laughed bitterly. "You know what your problem is, kid?" Elijah waited. "You forgot your place." And there it was, the truth underneath everything. Not the car, not the diagnostics, not even the embarrassment. Status, hierarchy. Preston could survive being wrong. He could not survive being corrected publicly by someone he viewed as beneath him. Curtis finally stepped forward from the valet line. Enough was enough. "With respect, sir," Curtis said carefully, "the young man just saved your event." Preston turned sharply. "You stay out of this." Curtis held eye contact anyway. Rare courage, expensive courage. Everybody in this room saw what happened. Preston's nostrils flared. Because once one person breaks social fear, others start waking up too. A woman near the front nodded quietly. Then another guest spoke. "He did fix it." More murmurs, momentum changing. Preston realized control was evaporating, so he reached for cruelty again. Last weapon left. "What's your name?" he asked Elijah. "Elijah? No last name?" "Elijah Carter." Preston smirked coldly. "Well, Elijah Carter..." He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a stack of cash, threw it onto the Ferrari hood. The slap echoed through the ballroom. "There." Several people visibly winced. "More money than you've probably ever seen." Elijah looked at the cash, didn't move. Preston smiled cruelly. "Go ahead." Still nothing. The silence stretched. Then Elijah asked quietly, "Do you always pay people by throwing money at them?" The room froze solid, because nobody had ever spoken to Preston Vale like that before. Not publicly, not calmly, not without fear. Preston's face darkened instantly. "You ungrateful little—" "Sir!" The voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, low, older, controlled. Everybody turned. A tall, gray-haired man in a dark navy suit stood near the ballroom entrance beside hotel security. Richard Hale, owner of the Valmont Grand, one of the most powerful hospitality executives in the country. And unlike Preston, Richard Hale didn't need to raise his voice to control a room. The atmosphere changed immediately. Guests straightened instinctively. Technicians stepped back. Even Preston's expression shifted, because real power recognizes itself instantly. Richard walked slowly toward the Ferrari, eyes moving from the cash to Elijah, to Preston. What exactly is happening here? Nobody answered immediately. That alone told Richard everything. He looked toward Martin. Martin swallowed. The young man diagnosed the Ferrari failure. Richard glanced at Elijah. "You work here?" "Yes, sir." "What department?" "Night maintenance." Richard studied him carefully, then looked at Preston. "And why," Richard asked quietly, "is there money being thrown at my employee like a circus act?" The silence afterward was brutal. Preston forced a laugh. "It was a joke." Nobody laughed with him. Richard's eyes never left Preston. "No," he said calmly, "it wasn't." And suddenly the billionaire who had dominated the room all night looked smaller. Not powerless, but exposed. Richard turned toward Elijah. What did you diagnose? Elijah explained quietly. No showing off, no dramatic technical speech, just precise detail. HVIL instability, microfractured shielding, intermittent grounding under vibration. Martin confirmed every word. Richard listened carefully, then asked the question that changed everything. Where did you learn hybrid systems? The ballroom waited. Elijah hesitated once. My father owned a repair garage. Owned? Elijah nodded. He passed away. Something softened briefly in Richard's expression. What was the garage called? Elijah and Sons Auto. Richard froze. Tiny reaction. Tiny but unmistakable. Curtis noticed immediately. Martin noticed too. Richard stared harder now. South Chicago? Yes, sir. The room went still again, because suddenly Richard Hale looked shaken. Not confused. Shaken. You're Marcus Carter's son? Elijah blinked once. You knew my father? Richard let out a slow breath, then laughed quietly to himself. Disbelief, memory, emotion. My God. Preston frowned. What? Richard looked around the ballroom slowly, then back at Elijah. Your father rebuilt the transmission on my first Aston Martin in 1998. Elijah stared silently. Richard smiled faintly. I was broke, 26 years old. Everybody else wanted replacement parts I couldn't afford. The room listened closely now. Your father repaired the entire assembly by hand. Richard shook his head slightly. Said machines deserve patience before replacement. Elijah looked down briefly, because that sounded exactly like him. Richard's eyes softened. Marcus Carter was one of the finest mechanics I ever met. Preston shifted uncomfortably. The room was slipping further away from him every second. Then Richard asked quietly, How long have you worked here? 8 months? Nobody knew you could do this? Elijah shrugged slightly. I didn't tell anybody. Richard looked around the ballroom slowly, at the guests, the technicians, the silence, then at Preston, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something dangerous beneath the calm. You mocked this young man in front of 200 people because of a uniform. Nobody moved. You threw money at him. Preston opened his mouth. Richard cut him off instantly. And meanwhile, your entire launch event would have collapsed tonight without him. The shame spreading through the ballroom became physical, heavy, visible. People avoided eye contact now, because everyone remembered laughing. Even the ones uncomfortable earlier remembered staying silent. That was the real sting, not cruelty. Cowardice. Preston forced another smile. You're overreacting. Richard stared at him. No, he said softly. I think everyone else underreacted. That line hit the room like a hammer. Several guests visibly looked downward. One woman quietly wiped tears from embarrassment. Curtis folded his arms tightly. Martin looked sick, because now the room wasn't just witnessing humiliation, it was confronting itself. Richard turned toward Elijah again. How much do we pay you here? Elijah hesitated. 16 an hour. A sharp intake of breath spread somewhere through the crowd. Richard nodded slowly, then looked at hotel management near the back. Effective immediately, Mr. Carter is transferred out of sanitation. Preston scoffed. Richard ignored him completely. I want him placed in engineering operations with full sponsorship for technical certification. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Elijah blinked, actually blinked. For the first time all night, his composure cracked slightly. Sir, Richard smiled faintly, your father once told me talent should never beg for permission. Silence again. But different now, warm, emotional, heavy in another way. Preston realized something terrifying in that moment. Nobody was looking at him anymore. Not really. The attention had shifted completely, and for men addicted to dominance, invisibility feels like death, so desperation took over. You can't seriously be turning a janitor into a hotel engineer because he guessed one issue. Martin spoke before thinking. He didn't guess. Everybody turned. Martin swallowed hard, then continued anyway. Most Ferrari technicians wouldn't have caught that fault without full disassembly. Richard nodded slightly. And he heard it. Martin looked at Elijah again, still stunned. Yes. Preston laughed bitterly. This is unbelievable. Richard finally looked directly at him again. No, he said calmly. What's unbelievable is how quickly powerful people mistake status for intelligence. The room went dead quiet, because everybody knew he wasn't only talking to Preston anymore. He was talking to all of them. Every silent witness, every nervous laugh, every lowered head. Elijah glanced toward the cash still sitting on the Ferrari hood, then quietly picked it up. Preston smirked instantly. There it is. But Elijah walked directly toward one of the hotel waitresses standing near the back. Young, nervous, clearly exhausted. He handed her the entire stack. For the staff, he said softly. The waitress looked stunned. The room looked stunned. And Preston Vale actually went pale, because in one motion Elijah had done something devastating. He exposed the difference between wealth and character, without a speech, without anger, without revenge, just dignity. The silence afterward felt irreversible. Richard watched Elijah carefully, then smiled, very slightly. Your father would be proud of you. Elijah looked away quickly after that, because some wounds never fully close, and suddenly the ballroom no longer felt like a luxury event. It felt like a courtroom. People started remembering every cruel thing they'd laughed at, every assumption they made the moment they saw coveralls instead of a suit. One older investor slowly approached Elijah, awkwardly. I owe you an apology, he admitted quietly. Elijah nodded once. Another guest followed, then another. Not dramatic, not performative, just uncomfortable people trying to repair their own conscience. Preston stood isolated beside his Ferrari, watching the entire room emotionally abandon him in real time. That was the punishment no billionaire could buy protection from. Social collapse. Respect disappearing publicly. And the worst part? Elijah never attacked him. Never insulted him. Never bragged. Preston lost the room entirely on his own. Martin walked slowly toward Elijah. I misjudged you, he admitted. Elijah looked at him calmly. You trusted the software. Martin exhaled slowly. Yeah. Elijah glanced toward the Ferrari. Machines lie less than people. Martin actually laughed once at that, softly, then shook Elijah's hand. A real handshake. Equal. The ballroom watched carefully, because symbols matter, especially after injustice. Curtis the valet wiped his eyes discreetly near the entrance. Not because of the Ferrari. Because he'd spent 30 years watching talented people get ignored the moment they wore the wrong uniform. And tonight, for once, the room had been forced to see it. Really see it. Richard eventually stepped onto the small presentation stage near the Ferrari display. The crowd quieted instantly. I want everyone here to remember something tonight, he said. No microphone needed. When people tell stories about moments like this, they focus on the genius. He glanced toward Elijah. But that's not the hardest part of the story. Silence. The hardest part is always the silence around the cruelty. Nobody moved. Richard let the weight sit there deliberately. 200 successful people stood in this ballroom tonight while a young man was publicly humiliated for the crime of appearing poor. The shame returned instantly, heavy, precise, and almost nobody intervened. No one could look at each other now, because he was right. Every single person knew he was right. Richard continued softly. Talent is common, dignity is rare, courage is rarer. Then he looked directly at Elijah. But integrity under humiliation... He shook his head slightly. That's exceptional. The room applauded then, slowly at first, then louder. Not celebration, recognition, something deeper. Elijah stood quietly beside the Ferrari while 200 people finally saw him clearly, not as a janitor, not as a poor kid, not as entertainment, as a human being. And somehow that felt bigger than the car ever did. Later that night, after the guests started leaving and the ballroom emptied into exhausted silence, Elijah returned downstairs alone. Same concrete floors, same buzzing fluorescent lights, same smell of bleach and old pipes. But something felt different now. Not because he'd proven himself, he never needed that. Because for a few brief hours, the world upstairs had been forced to confront the world downstairs, and those worlds very rarely meet honestly. Elijah grabbed his mop again quietly. Routine, familiar, grounding. Then footsteps approached behind him. Richard Hale. No suit jacket now, just an older man carrying the weight of memory in his eyes. You really were going back to work, Richard said softly. Elijah shrugged. Shift's not over. Richard laughed quietly. Your father used to do that too. Silence settled between them, comfortable this time. Then Richard asked, Why didn't you tell anyone what you could do? Elijah leaned lightly against the wall. Nobody asked janitors about engines. Richard nodded slowly, painfully true. Elijah? He hesitated. Your father saved my business once. Elijah looked up. Richard smiled faintly. Back before money. Back before hotels. My delivery truck died during a winter contract that would have bankrupted me if I missed it. He shook his head slightly. Marcus fixed it overnight for almost nothing. Elijah listened quietly. He told me something I never forgot. Richard looked toward the buzzing hallway lights. He said the world trains people to notice uniforms before humanity. A long silence followed. Then Richard looked directly at Elijah. I failed that lesson tonight. Elijah immediately shook his head. No, sir. Yes, Richard said softly, because you worked in my building for 8 months and nobody important noticed you until rich people needed something. That sentence hung heavy in the hallway, because it was bigger than Elijah. Bigger than the Ferrari. It was about invisible people everywhere. Workers, cleaners, maintenance crews, delivery drivers, people society depends on while pretending not to see. Richard reached into his pocket slowly. Not money, a business card. My direct number. Elijah took it carefully. You ever want engineering school, Richard said, or your own garage someday? He smiled faintly. Don't disappear back into silence. Elijah looked at the card for a long moment, then nodded once. Thank you. Richard started walking away, then stopped. One more thing. Elijah looked up. That Ferrari? Yeah? Richard smiled. You fixed more than the car tonight. Then he disappeared down the corridor. Elijah stood there alone beside flickering maintenance lights, holding a mop in one hand and a future in the other. And upstairs, in expensive hotel suites and black luxury SUVs heading home through midnight streets, people sat unusually quiet. Because humiliation is easy when society tells you someone matters less. But regret arrives later, quietly, when the laughter fades, when the cameras stop recording, when people realize they witnessed cruelty and chose comfort over courage. Some guests would forget by morning, others wouldn't. Martin Griggs didn't sleep at all that night. Neither did the young waitress Elijah gave the money to. Neither did Curtis. And Preston Vale? He woke up to millions of views, because somebody uploaded the confrontation online. Not the Ferrari fix, the humiliation. The comments were brutal. You can tell everything about a person by how they treat workers. That kid had more class than the Millionaire. He stayed calmer than everyone in the room. Preston exposed himself. The internet moved fast. Sponsors moved faster. Within 48 hours, Preston released a carefully polished statement about misunderstanding and stress during a live event. Nobody believed it. Because people can sense the difference between a mistake and a worldview. And what hurt Preston most wasn't cancellation. It was comparison. Every viral clip placed his arrogance beside Elijah's calm dignity. One man desperate to feel superior. One young man refusing to become bitter even when humiliated publicly. That contrast destroyed him. Meanwhile, Elijah returned to work Monday morning expecting awkwardness. Instead, he found something stranger. People looking him directly in the eye. Security greeting him respectfully. Engineers asking questions. Staff members smiling. Tiny things. Human things. Things that should have existed already. Curtis handed him coffee during break and grinned. You broke the internet, kid. Elijah laughed quietly. First real laugh in the whole story. And somehow that mattered too. Because healing doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it's just the moment somebody finally feels seen. 3 months later, Elijah entered the Valmont Engineering Division full-time. 6 months later, Ferrari Corporate contacted him directly after Martin submitted a private report detailing the diagnosis. 1 year later, Elijah Carter opened a small hybrid performance garage on the south side using investment help from Richard Hale. He named it Carter & Sons Automotive. Not because his father was gone. Because legacy isn't burial. It's continuation. And every now and then, late at night after the shop closed and jazz played softly through old speakers while sparks flickered beneath lifted engines, Elijah would pause beside a machine and listen carefully, the same way his father taught him. Because engines still tell the truth eventually. People do too. That's why stories like this matter. Not because a Ferrari got repaired. Not because a billionaire got embarrassed. Because somewhere right now, somebody brilliant is being ignored because of how they look. Somebody kind is being mistaken for weak. Somebody talented is being laughed at because their clothes don't match the room. And somewhere else, people are staying silent while it happens. That silence is how cruelty survives. Not just through bullies. Through witnesses, through nervous laughter, through people waiting for somebody else to speak first. But every once in a while, somebody does. And the entire room changes. So the real question isn't whether Elijah fixed the Ferrari. The real question is this. If you were standing in that ballroom, who would you have been? The man throwing money, the crowd laughing, the people staying silent, or the one person willing to speak up before it was safe? And if this story meant something to you, it took some money to get, if you believe dignity matters more than status, then subscribe, because the world already has enough people who worship power. What it needs more of is people willing to recognize greatness before permission is given.